What's up, hobby friends, and welcome to my hobby hangout video where I share my experience with the recent Capital City Bloodbath event I attended back in mid-August. So this was a 6-game Age of Sigmar event, and I wanted to share just my experiences with playing these 6 games. The majority of them were opponents I hadn't played in quite a long time against armies I actually don't have a lot of experience with. And prior to this event, I'd only gotten about, I would say, 6 practice games in with the new handbook in the new battle plans. Some of them were repeats, and so I think I was really going into this event blind. I was kind of familiar with my army, general sense of sort of where some of those meta armies are, but again, a brand new experience. So this video will be a little bit longer than normal. I'm expecting probably about an hour, hour and a half, but I'll see how much I can cut it down in the editing. And a little bit more freeform, hopefully not too rambly, but I'll try and stick to a general agenda or an approach to the way I break down the list and then each of the games I played. So the real goal for this is to walk through and share my approach to the game, how I built my army, and then how I approached each of the battle plans. So for each mission, I wanted to think about what my opponent's game plan was based on their list and the battle plan, what my approach would be to counter that, and then the actual execution. Did my opponent do what I think they were going to do, or did they approach it differently? How did I approach it based on my plan? Did it change or adapt? And then what I would do differently. So this is the list I brought, and it's almost identical to what I ran in the previous handbook. I don't think the new season changes a lot of the way that Caradron may want to approach a game, depending on, I think, the meta that you expect to face, and of course your playstyle has a huge impact as well. So briefly walking through it, so Caradron Overlords, my sub-faction is Rationale, and I'll touch on why I prefer this sub-faction later on, but the general gist of this is it improves Brock, and it gives me command points from my heroes. I do find that KO is a very command point hungry army, and the more command points you have, the better the buffer is. I've played a lot of Lumineth in the past, and they have the one spell, I forget what it's called, but basically all your command points cost double. So the difference between having only 3 or 4 command points versus 6, 7, or even maybe 8 is potentially big. It makes the army a lot more reliable, a lot more consistent, and I know I can do the things I want to do. My grand strategy is rule the skies, basically have any one of my sky vessels alive, which is the ships, and no enemy flying behemoths at the end of the game. Fairly standard, and I think against half of the armies in the game, this is an auto pass as long as you keep a ship alive. For the Triumph, because I am at 1970, I chose Inspired, which is +1 to wound. I think it's probably the better value of the one. My army's small enough that Battle Shock isn't a big deal, and with my once per game 3d6 charge and the ability to reroll charges from command points in combination with having tons of command points through Baraknar, I think Inspired for +1 to wound is just a bit more consistency when I want to try and nuke a target. For the amendment, Prosecute Wars basically gives all of my ships +2 inch move. Master the Skies, I believe that's the once per turn, a Caradron unit can run 2d6 inches. And then for the footnote, there's no reward without risk. Once per game, a Sky Vessel can make a 3d6 charge and can declare it at 18 as opposed to 12. So the basic plan is I'm relying a lot more on the mobility of my ships. It allows me to get my frigates or my frigate in range for combat faster. I can position my Ironclad to get the guns in range. And it also gives me that extra movement boost for when I'm trying to do bombing runs. Master the Skies, again, mobility, get my ships in range. I typically use this for my Ironclad to run into range for shooting. And then the once per game 3d6 charge, guarantee a charge, especially if I fly high, get my frigate within 9 inches, and try and alpha a target out. It just makes that 9 inch charge a lot more consistent. The average on 3d6 is 10.5 inches, and with a reroll, it makes it fairly consistent unless you sort of flub the dice. For my leaders, I've got Brock Grungson, an Arcana Admiral who is my general, and his command trait is the Stormcaller. I've got a Navigator with the Voidstone Orb, and then an Endrin Master with Harness, and the Pouch of Null Dust for the Nullstone Adornment. So basically, the Admiral, as the general, allows the Ironclad to again have that efficiency as the flagship. They get a free command point every single turn, so that's player turn, your turn and your opponent's. And then his command trait for Stormcaller allows the Navigator to reroll his Read the Skies ability. It actually came into play quite a bit, both in my practice games and at the event. There were quite a number of turns where I either rolled only 1-1 or 1-6 or rolled none at all. And it allows me to reroll and fish for either the 1s or 6s I want just for that consistency. More often than not, if I can, I'm aiming for the 6s in the early phases of the game for some extra mobility, and then 1s in the mid and late game to really hamper enemy mobility. There are some exceptions in the early game where I do fish for 1s a lot more against particularly fast armies or armies where I need to slow down key units. I'll fish for those 1s to try and plink those mortal wounds and half the movement of those enemy units. The Endrin Master is key for making the Rigger's battle line. And then in play, while the Nullstone Orb, I think, is kind of niche for giving you an extra unbind and potentially more if you consistently unbind. The problem is you still need to be in range to unbind, and you have to actually succeed the first unbind to continue doing it. So I found that very often I either wasn't in range or I would just fail the unbind and be unable to use it later on. Whereas with the Pouch of Null Dust, it's guaranteed to happen once per turn or once per game. Basically, double 1s, 2s, or 3s are miscast. If they throw primal dice, they're primal miscasts. I can try and unbind every endless spell on the board on a 5+. I think it's just a great way to threaten shutting down a turn of magic rather than try and get all these puzzle pieces in range for being in range, succeeding in casting, and just things like that. And then Brock, I like him because he's fairly durable for a hero. He brings good combat power, especially when he charges in. He has that +1 attack buff AoE, really improves Riggers and my other heroes. And then he brings the firepower of a frigate for 220 points. I really like him, and he's part of the reason why I bring Barak Nar. And then with the Barak Nar for the command points, I don't need to bring a Code Right, which does save me, I think it's like 90 or 95 points. For my battle line, I've got 2 units of Riggers, 1 unit of 6 as my main combat block, a unit of 3. The unit of 3 has the grapnel launcher for just a bit of extra mobility, getting around the board, taking objectives, or scoring battle tactics, trying to get to board edges. And then I've got a unit of 10 Arcanauts, 1 with each special weapon and the squad leader. This one was mainly just to fill a boat, add in some extra bodies to protect my heroes from shooting, and then act as a screen or to block out on objectives. For my ships, I've got 2 behemoths. I've got the Ironclad and the frigate. The Ironclad is the flagship, so again, it gets that free command point per turn. And then the engine work is the last word. So at the end of the charge phase, enemy charge phase, you can shoot the main cannon at an enemy unit within 3 inches, and there's no penalty or modifier to it, like stand and shoot or unleash hell. Basically, it makes the Ironclad an anchor for my list. I put my Admiral, Navigator, the Arcanauts, and 3 Riggers in there, and it acts as a denial and control piece. The frigate has the Omniscope for the extra move, so in combination with Prosecuting Wars, it moves 16 inches, which actually is a huge boost. That extra 4 inches really comes into play. And in the frigate, I usually put Brock, the Endrin Master, as well as the 6 Riggers. So this is my main combat block. I throw it in there. It acts as a mid-close range assault piece, and I use it to pick off key units once I've shot them apart, finish them off in combat. And then my last unit is a gun hauler. I use this as a bit of a blocker, and then mainly for scoring battle tactics. So all of this fits into a 5-drop army. I've got the Battle Regiment, which is, I believe it was the Endrin Master, all of the Riggers, the Arcanaut, as well as the frigate and the gun hauler. And then in the command entourage for Magnificent, which gives me the extra artifact, I've got Brock, Admiral, and Navigator. And then the Ironclad sits separate. Total package, 1970. The reason I don't go for a 1-drop is because of the artifact requirement. So the army gets 1 for free. So you put 1 on the Navigator for the Voidstone Orb, and then you get, I won't say 1 for free. So sorry, you get an engine work on a ship for free. So you put, let's call it the last word on the Ironclad. And then I really want the Voidstone Orb as a Dispel Scroll. So you take the, I think it gives you 1 for the army. So that's the Orb. And then I think the Omniscope on the frigate is essential as an assault piece. It makes it a lot more mobile and consistently able to position and get into place. And because the Ironclad and the frigate are both behemoths, you can't fit them in a 1-drop anyways. So if I'm doing multiple drops, why not just take the command entourage? It gives me a couple of null deploys, and then it allows me to afford that extra artifact. So the way that I typically deploy my army is I'll put the Ironclad as the first drop, just centrally in the middle of the border backer, in the corner. If it's a quarter deployment, I'll then drop the Admiral and the Navigator inside it, and I've really not put down a whole lot. Most opponents will typically be in the 1 or 2 drop range. Once I see where the army goes, I can then deploy the frigate and the gun hauler to counter, and then allocate all my units inside the boats as I see fit. Sometimes you can put Brock inside the Ironclad to start. That gives you an extra opportunity if the opponent is a 5-drop. You can see where all of their stuff goes if you're dropping second, and then you can drop everything else afterwards, and then on your first turn, disembark Brock, move him to the frigate, and then embark him inside, and that'll be sort of a good reallocation to have that sort of shifting of drops. The basic plan with the army is, it's because you're such a low model count, you can't really contest hordes for objectives. And so very often, depending on whether you go first or second, I will look to concede 1 or 2 points in the first 2 turns of the game, try and take out key enemy units, and then make up the points difference once I've taken out those key units in the latter turn 3, 4, 5 of the game to try and swing the game in my favor. It's a real balancing act, which I think is also why I like the army so much, because it's figuring out how much to concede early on, how much board control you need to give to your opponent, and trying to figure out, okay, when is the turn, or when is the moment I have to then start striking and attacking and really being more aggressive to start scoring more of those points, try and swing the points in your favor. In practice, there were actually a couple of battle plans that forced my hand early on that I think I would approach differently if I were to play those games again. But for the most part, I think the plan works relatively well. And with the mobility of the army, it's definitely very easy to control the board for where you're going to be. And I find that most opponents will tend to want to castle up as a counter to prevent you from picking off their units. If your opponent tends to scatter to try and control everything on the board or just block everything out, you have a lot of an easier time to pick out those 1 or 2 key units because there's very little in the range to counterattack. But if your opponent castles, it's much harder for you to charge in and attack something because you risk being counterstruck by everything else in their army. I'll touch more on this in one of my games because that's actually how my opponent played, which is actually very smart. It's how I would play it, and I was just a bad matchup, and I don't think there's much I could really do. The battle plan also factors very heavily into how easy or difficult your game is going to be. Caradron prefer games where you have a lot of objectives spread out across the board, which makes it a lot easier to score the 1, 2 more. Battle plans that have 2 or 3 centralized objectives that force your opponents or the armies to meet in a centralized area become much, much harder because your opponents aren't really incentivized or required to spread out. And you then have to figure out, okay, am I going to be able to attack this castle and pull them apart? How do I score those points without overextending or risking that counterstrike. I also build the army around the mobility, and scoring battle tactics is a big part of the game. I think the new edition really favors Caradhran because a lot of the book tactics require mobility and being able to move around. That in combination with the battle tome battle tactics that you have, I think it's very easy for KO to find 5 battle tactics to score throughout the game. You just need to make sure that you pick and choose each one and have an idea for what tactic you want to choose for the next game. In particular, there's a couple in the battle tome where you get everything out of the boat in the enemy territory and then get everything inside the boat. That does require a bit of setup. So sometimes you can just combo it with the be within 6 of 3 table edges, and then the next turn disembark without spending the command point to disembark. So you can fly high, run and shoot, do whatever, and then that turn afterwards, everything gets back inside the boat. So definitely a bit of a planner's army, but I think that's sort of why I enjoy playing the army a lot. I think in retrospect, I would probably drop the Arcanauts for another unit of 3 Riggers. In practice, I think the Arcanauts as a screen function about as well as 3 Riggers do. They don't have the same footprint. I think 10 Arcanauts strung out is about 9.5 inches, and 3 Riggers spread out is only about 5.5. So you lose a bit of that buffer, but the utility of 3 Riggers, both in terms of shooting and combat and repairing, I think just provides much better value compared to the Arcanauts. And I think moving forward for the next few games I'm going to play, I'm going to try swapping out the Arcanauts for the unit of 3 Riggers. It'll bring me to, I think, 2,000 points exact, and I'll see how it goes. So my game 1 opponent was Tim Lee running Soulblight Gravelords. Tim used to hang out a lot with us back when he lived in Toronto. Great guy, love playing against him, and this was a great chance to actually get a game against him in a number of years, probably since 2014, and just catch up. His army is Nagash, which I'm super familiar with, having run Nagash a lot back in the early days of 2nd edition Age of Sigmar, back when Legion of Grief was still a thing. A Vampire Lord, Necromancer, 2 blocks of 20 zombies, 10 skeletons, 20 Graveguard, a Corpse Guard, and then a couple of endless spells, so the Maelstrom and the Spell Portal. The battle plan is lines of communication. So there's 3 central objectives with your standard pick battle deployment, 11 inches up, hold 1, hold 2, hold more, 2 for the tactic, 3 for the grand strat. And then the special thing for this scenario is that if you go second, you get to pick a battle phase of the game. And on a 3+, any command abilities cost an extra command point. If you don't have the command point to spend or don't spend it, the command fails and you count as having used it and also spent your initial point. So I'm not familiar with Soulblight. This was the first of 2 games that I played against Soulblight this weekend. So this was a great learning experience for me for what the army does. Nagash being the central piece and my familiarity with it, so I know what the army is generally going to want to do. There's only 3 objectives on the board, so I would just castle up, hold 2 objectives, and then have Nagash parked right in the center of the army as a counterstrike, and then just threaten Blizzard and a Hand of Dust every turn. The ability to hero phase teleport the vampire to cast Blizzard and then teleport him back to safety in combination with Spell Portal and Hand of Dust means that I don't have or I can't afford to drag this game out long enough, and that Nagash is going to make or break the game for me. I need to find an opening to take out Nagash in 1 turn. Otherwise, I think if the game goes to turn 3, 4, or 5, just the odds are not going to work against me. He's going to either Irresistible Blizzard or cast it off on a turn where I can't stop it, just do tons of mortal wounds. And honestly, with Hand of Dust being a 50-50, at some point I will fail and I will lose a ship. Odds are probably both the Frigate and the Ironclad would die to Hand of Dust over a 5-turn game if Nagash is left alive. So the actual deployment in terms of the way I approached it was basically to spread my army out, not give him an idea of where I was going to go, which objectives I was going to commit to. And I believe he had the lower drops, but chose to take the first turn, which is kind of curious for me because I think I would have given me the first turn, played for the double, or at the very least denying a double, see where I would commit, and then use that knowledge to sort of position the gash. But he chose not to, and so he put everything in graves and just had the skeletons, corpse cart with his heroes on the board. I counter deployed with the ironclad in the center, and then the frigate on the left, gun hauler on the right. I figured depending on which side he would actually commit to, I could then just fly high the opposite ship to the opposite side and just play around from there. Again, my goal was to basically take up the gash as quickly as possible, and that would basically make or break the game. Wouldn't be turn one because he had that +1 save, +1 ward bubble going on, so that meant that I would have to wait a turn. His first turn, he actually tried to push up, and with the grave sites started dropping in zombies. At the second turn, he tried the Hand of Dust and the Blizzard and failed both. So Blizzard failed to cast. I got lucky there, and with the Hand of Dust, he did an Irresistible. So I used my Voidstone Orb to basically dispel it, and then I had my opening. That was pretty much, I think, the only chance I would have to take on the gash. In the first turn, I chipped a couple of mortal wounds using the Read the Winds to both slow down the gash as well as I can just do those mortal wounds. And I believe he had 16 wounds left on him. So I committed everything, did the flyby pass with both the frigate and the ironclad. And then just a combination of lucky shooting and some really unlucky saves. He rolled a lot of ones. I actually took up Nagash in the shooting phase of that second turn. So that meant that I could just commit to the combat, and I started to remove his units. And by the end of the third turn, he was pretty much tabled and I had the board. So a fairly quick game, very efficient. I think my opponent played the battle plan as I expected him to, doing the castle. I approached it exactly like I thought I would, concede those early points, take out Nagash being the key piece, and then clean up. I think his decision to take the priority on turn one and let me go second was a bit of a puzzling piece. I think he would have done a lot better if he gave me the turn, played for the double, or just played for not being doubled. But yeah, I think it just came down to dice. If I didn't kill Nagash, I think he would have had many opportunities to continue lifting my army, and that's it. My second game was against Carl Ong, running Sylvaneth, another local from Toronto. I've played games against him before, but he tends to game with a different hobby group. They go to a lot more tournaments, and so we typically don't bump into each other except in events. I do believe because of COVID, the last time I played him was probably 2018, 2019. So it's been a number of years, but again, great opponent, great guy. He always brings some pretty interesting lists, and our games are always very fun, but also very efficient. I think anecdotally, this game was probably over in 45 minutes. We played 4 turns, I think it was, and called it on the 5th. We knew exactly he knew what our army did, and his army is fairly straightforward, and so we were able to play our turns out very quickly. So his list is Sylvaneth, not again sure what most of the army does, but in terms of on the table, fairly straightforward. Tree Lord Ancient, Branch Witch, sorry. He's got 3 units of Seekers, which are the Beetle Cavalry. So 1 big block of 6, 2 units of 3, 5 Tree Revenants for teleporting around objectives and for doing battle tactics, and then Gotrek Gurnison, along with a single end of spell, which is the Hive, which I believe is the +3 inch charge on a 2+. So basically, he uses his either the Tree Lord or the big unit of 6 Seekers to strike and fade. They fly in or teleport, charge something with a +3 in charge, attack, and then they teleport away before you can strike back, while the rest of his army focuses on controlling the board, taking objectives, and denying you points. Gotrek is used, I think, as a bully piece, and for those of you who have never played against Gotrek before, you don't fight Gotrek. You either throw something in at him like Gotrek that can hold him down forever, or can throw enough volume at him to force him to fail saves. Super durable, things that do high damage or effects or abilities that do a lot of damage or mortal wounds get dropped down to 1. So he's very efficient at tanking high quality, high damage attacks, which is most of what my army does. My army doesn't really have the volume to chip him down. So looking at the list, I know similar to Nagash, it'll come down to, can I stay away from Gotrek? If yes, then his army is missing a lot of the teeth to do damage. If Gotrek engages me, he's going to remove whatever he touches. So the battle plan is no reward without risk, 5 objectives in a cross pattern with a quarter deployment. It's hold 1, hold 2, hold more, 2 for the tactic, 3 for the grand strat. The special thing for this battle plan is wizards explode on a 4+ when they die. Great for me, bad for him, or maybe the other way around because I have no wizards. I think his approach to this game, again, use Gotrek to probably hold the center, and then depending on where I commit, he can push Gotrek in that direction. But more than likely, because of my mobility, I think I can probably keep Gotrek at a distance unless he actually manages to double turn me. I'm not familiar with the Seekers, but know they are fast, and I know with his ability to deploy trees down and teleport, it'll come down to castling and screening until I can either remove the Tree Lord or at least the big block of Seekers, and then pick off his wizard and unbind the endless spell. So basically my plan was to hold the corner points, wait for him to commit to me, or see at least where he chooses to engage on the board, and then pick off the key units, and then by turn, I think 3, start to try and swing those points back. I didn't want to concede more than 1 point every turn. If I concede 2 points, then it becomes much, much harder to play catch-up from turn 3, 4, 5 later on. So I think positioning on Gotrek and not being double-turned was going to be key to winning this game. So this was the board in terms of deployment. So you can see that he's got Gotrek relatively in the center, just contesting the center objective. He's got 3 and 3 Seekers ready to fly off and sort of take out objectives or corners on the board. His big block of 6 that he can use to either teleport to a tree or throw in, control his flanks with his characters and the Tree Lord in the forest. I chose to null deploy in the corner entirely. I wasn't exactly sure on the damage output of the Seekers, and so I intentionally deployed outside their threat range. I made sure that short of teleporting to trees, he would not be able to get his 6 Seekers or the 3 on the far side into combat turn 1. Or if he did, it would be with the gun hauler, and I'd try and be able to shoot him. And of course, just making sure that Gotrek, even with a double, couldn't move and run and engage me or block off my sort of territory or zone. Pretty much in practice, worked out exactly like I thought it would. I disembarked 3 riggers, and I toe tagged another objective with the gun hauler just to score my hold 1, hold 2, and I null deployed again on the opposite corner, positioning for future battle tactics. So get out, get back in the boat, have units wholly within 6 of table edges, things like that. He had a couple of unlucky turns where he would throw the 6 Seekers into the frigate, bounce off, and then strike and fade. With the stand and shoot, I was able to chip away at the unit. And over the course of those 2 turns, I was also able to remove both the units of the 3 Seekers. And from there, it was pretty much just a textbook game of playing keep away. No one scored a double turn. We were able to maintain the priority. Gotrek was never a threat because of it. Anytime I would have a chance to score a double turn, I would, because of the board positioning, I would give him priority, let him take the first move of the turn, and basically guarantee that his Gotrek would never have the opportunity to score a double turn on me. So just that in combination with the board control that I had, I was able to just chip away, remove the Seekers, and once the Seekers were all gone, I was able to teleport onto the back of the flank, and remove his branch witch, which denied his grand strat and score me the game. I think the game played out pretty much as expected. I think if his dice had been a little bit better, the game might have played out differently. If his unit of 6 Seekers hadn't bounced off the frigate and the guys inside 2 combat turns in a row, I would have had fewer options in terms of both my shooting and combat power. If that had been the case, I probably would have had to play cagier. I wouldn't have done as much damage to the army as I would have. He probably would have scored his Grand Strat because I wouldn't have killed his Branch Witch. And it would come down to, can I deny those 1 or 2 points in the final turns of the game? Because of the way that the priority played out, I think it still would have worked out. Gotrek never getting a chance to double turn me means that he would never be able to charge. I kept him at like the 16-inch range, and he would never get in combat as a result. And so I think there wasn't much that he could do once his secret units just started to fall apart. So my third game was against Yuri, running his Osiarch Bone Reapers. So I think this is probably the best army in the game in this current meta right now. And I'll touch on it more in a bit, but I think this battle plan heavily favors this army, and it hurts me. So I knew going in this was going to be an uphill battle, just in terms of stat checking and the battle plan. As a note, Yuri did end up winning Capital City. His army went 6-0, undefeated. So in retrospect, don't feel bad losing to first place. His army, no myriad, so on a 2+, they ignore spell effects on the units. Bone Shaper, Soul Reaper, Catacross. Again, this is what, 6 Immortus Guard, 3 Immortus Guard, 5 Death Riders, 6 Stalkers, and then he's running a Battle Regiment and the Acolytes. The battle plan itself is 4 objectives, but they're paired. So whoever's going second picks either the A objectives or the B objectives to hold. They're the active ones. The way the scoring works is you hold 1, hold both. You get 1 extra point if the objective you control is also being contested by a locus. 2 points for your tactic, 3 for the grand strat. Otherwise, fairly straightforward game. The territories are halves of the board, but you have to be 9 inches away from the territory, so you still have to be at least 18 inches apart. I knew going in that, again, this is going to be an incredibly uphill battle. I have no locuses, and the way that his army works, because he can pass off wounds from his locus onto the units around them, I would have to basically kill all the Immortus Guard, all the Stalkers, to be able to kill the Wizards. I don't think I can do that in a 5-turn game, especially if he castles, to deny his at least scoring the extra point every single turn. So at a bare minimum, right, if we both just trade off, no one moves, if we each hold an objective, I can't kill his Wizards, and he's going to score that extra point every single turn for having a Wizard controlling that objective. So I would have to hope for a mistake or hope for an opening to try and pick off some units and then get to his Wizards. But I don't think in this battle plan against this army, short of a miracle or a misplay, that KO actually have a chance of winning. I also didn't realize until we started playing the game that they had changed Catacross so that his ability, his buff, gave the 2+ save to all Bone Reapers in range. So I used to play Bone Reapers back in the day, and it used to just be Mortis Praetorians that got the +1 save. But the fact that his entire army gets it means he has that 2+ save, 1+ if he all out defenses, which means that most of my attacks are going to bounce off, which again factors into the fact that I don't think I can do enough damage to this army over a 5-turn game to score the points. So in terms of deployment, he pretty much castled his army as expected. Catacross in the center with blocks on both sides. I think his only mistake was committing the Stalkers to the his right flank, my left flank, while the rest of his army committed to the right and Catacross relatively central. I personally would have just castled. I would have sat somewhere around here so that he always has this one or this one. My army's never going to take the objectives from him, so I'm never going to hold 2 for holding both. I'm also never going to kill the Wizard. So at a bare minimum, he'll score the 2 points every turn to my 1, and he'll outpace me or outscore me on points every single turn. His grand strat is to keep his Wizard alive, which again, I can't kill. I will achieve mine because he has no flying behemoths, but I still lose on the actual objective points. My deployment, fairly standard for the way I play my army, no deploying. Ironclad in the center, Frigate on one side, Gun Hauler on the other, just to see where he would go, which flank he would commit to. I would commit to the opposite. He ended up committing the Stalkers to the left flank, while his entire army went to the right. I did end up removing them. I lifted them with a combination of all my shooting, flying over with mortal wounds, and then the combat power. The only downside is I did overexpose the units right here. This right here, I think, was a fairly long charge. Even with the +3 move, it ended up being a 9-inch requirement. This was after his movement. No, you're right. This was after his movement. So this distance was 12 inches on both. I had spaced out to basically, if he boxcars me, he's going to win the game. Honestly, nothing I can do about it. But I felt I was a safe enough distance away that he wouldn't be able to charge me, and I would be able to get another turn to get back in the boats, reposition, and maybe try and hope for lifting some of his other units. This was at the bottom of the turn. He ended up winning the priority, so this is the start of the turn. He ended up making both the boxcar charges with the Stalkers and Catacross, and he ended up lifting all of this. So the Gun Hauler, the Frigate, Brock, the Endermaster, and those Riggers just all removed in a turn. He made those combats, and pretty much that was the game. Again, I don't think there was anything I could do about this. This was always going to be, I think, his game to lose. Played it as best I could. I think this is just the rock, paper, scissors nature of Age of Sigmar, and something you have to expect. Best army in the game, worst battle plan, 4 KO, just the perfect storm. My fourth game of the day was against Stormcast Eternals. My opponent was Peter, my first new opponent of the weekend, and I haven't played against Stormcast since the early days of 2nd edition. So I'm not super familiar with most of what the army does, except I know that Annihilators are tanky, and I know that the Raptors, the long straight Raptors, shoot, and they do mortal wounds when they shoot. Good range. I think they have command phase, shoot twice, and then their heroes and their units do a bunch of stuff. My opponent was fairly new to the game, and so we didn't actually play through all 5 turns. We only got 4, which resulted in the minor win for me. But I think if we had played a 5th turn, this would have been a major. I don't think this would have had a huge impact on the standings. I might have gone up a place or 2, but honestly, I don't really care. So his army, Lord Imperator, Heralder, Incantor, and the Arcanum. He's got 5 Sequitors, 5 Vanquishers, and 5 Liberators for his battle line, 2 units of 3 Annihilators, 3 units of 3 Prosecutors, and then 2 units of 3 Raptors. So just a bit of everything. I don't think he felt it was the most optimized list. He more or less just picked up a couple of start collecting boxes, panning up what he had, and just played with it. So not the most effective army, although there were some good things about it. I think his idea was pretty good. Personally, so the way I would play his army, not really being familiar with Stormcast, but knowing the battle plan, start off on one side, drain a few objectives, and slowly move across the board using his bodies to basically bubble wrap and block out deep strike avenues for me, while his long strikes just pick off and shoot characters, units, and ships. I think the Annihilators are super tanky, great to drop in and alpha strike something, but I'm not sure on their damage output, so unless they drop both at the same time, I don't know if they're as big a threat compared to things like 10 Evocators or something, but it is what it is. I think this was probably the game I was most apprehensive about because I knew nothing about the army, and this battle plan was actually fairly complicated. So the battle plan is limited resources. There's 6 objectives in this sort of staggered formation with a halved deployment more than 9 inches away. The way you score is you hold 1, you hold 2, you hold more, 2 for your tactic, free for your grand strat. The special thing with this mission is if you control an objective for 2 of your consecutive turns. So if you controlled it in your previous turn and you controlled it again in this turn, then it was effectively drained and you can no longer score points for that objective for the rest of the game. Now, it's a little confusing because I don't think the battle plan clarifies if it matters if the objective controlled or changed hands in between. So let's say, for example, if I held an objective in my turn, my opponent took it back and held it in his turn, and then I took that same objective back and held it again in my subsequent turn. By the wording of the battle plan, because I held it in my previous turn and then my current turn, I have now drained it, even though the objective did change hands. That's how the way that we played it, but I don't know if it's supposed to be held for 2 consecutive turns without changing hands. There's no FAQ for it, and I don't know. But basically, the complexity is to figure out how many objectives to hold, knowing that your opponent will probably not try and take it from you, and you basically only get those 2 turns of scoring, and you then have to move on. So my plan was to basically pick a flank, hold those objectives, remove his key units, and just collapse one of his flanks, and sort of just move around. If I could do, say, the 2 here, and then just rotate around either this way or this way, I could score enough points while denying him points that I could eventually chip away his army and win out the game. So in terms of deployment, I null deployed my ironclad and my frigate in the corner with my frigate out in the center here. Because of the way that he was a 10 drop, 10 or 12 drop, I more or less didn't know where things were going to land. And so I chose an area, because we had declared these as impassable just for simplicity, not going on top. You can go through. I tried to limit avenues for where you could deep strike and land combat units to get through to me. If his long strikes did land somewhere, they would gum up his own units, or he would have to deploy them in avenues with limited line of sight. And basically, if he chose to charge in, I would be able to stand and shoot and last word with the ironclad, and then be able to fight with everything. I didn't realize that annihilators could drop within 7 inches, which made those charges a little bit more consistent, but in the actual gameplay, it didn't matter as much. I had the gun all out here just to sort of bracket and push units out and maybe draw some attention away. He deployed his guys in lines to just form a wall with his prosecutors, the winged guys, as sort of an alpha thing to try and gum up and tie down or engage my units. In terms of the way that the game actually played out, he alphaed almost everything. So both long strikes, he alphaed in 1 unit of annihilators, and then he pushed up his winged bird guys to try and engage. He kept 1 unit of annihilators in reserve. Shooting didn't do a whole lot, and his annihilators, while they charged in, didn't do enough damage to really kill anything or to cripple a ship. So basically, I was able to disengage and basically start to shoot his stuff off. I think I removed most of the prosecutors, both the long strikes and the annihilators, in my subsequent turn. And from there, it was just, he didn't have the tools to deal with me. He didn't have the speed from the prosecutors to control the objectives. Once the long strikes were gone, he didn't have any shooting to try and threaten my unit from range. And with only 1 unit of annihilators in reserve, after having seen what 1 unit did to my army, the other unit of 3 wasn't really a threat. He knew it and I knew it, and so he held them in reserve to try and take an objective and maybe threaten something that was weakened in later phases, but I never really gave him the opportunity. From there, I just chased him around the board, and it was just sequencing the objectives to make sure that I was always scoring 1-2 more. Again, we only played up till the 4th turn, and by that point, he didn't have much of an army. I think this was the board state at the end of the 4th turn. After the charges, I removed both the heroes. I had the ironclad position to shoot everything off when we called it. If I had played a 5th turn, I would have been able to actually score out the points. So the way the scoring worked out, we were completely tied in terms of grand strat and the objective points. But the way the differential worked was that while we were tied on points, I had completed more tactics than he had, which gave me the minor win according to the battle plan. If I had that one extra turn, I would have controlled the board, he would have scored no objectives, and that would have scored me the points to win the major win. Again, I don't think it would have made a huge impact on the standings. I might have gone up 1 or 2 places. Would I have done anything differently, being more familiar with the army? I don't think so. I think I might have used the Arcanauts in the beginning, right here, to screen a little bit more and prevent his Annihilators and his Prosecutors from gumming up. I wouldn't have had to use my command points to disengage, and I might have had a little bit more mobility initially to fly high or move around. But the game played out otherwise as expected. I don't think his army was or had many threats once the long strikes and Annihilators were gone. And because he didn't commit both Annihilators in the same turn, he piecemealed them in one after another. Their damage output just wasn't as high. So my 5th game, and the first of day 2, was against Soulblight Gravelords as well. I want to say my opponent's name was Richard. I might have actually mixed up my opponent's names. I think it might have been Richard in the previous game and Peter for this one. So if you're watching this video, I apologize. I'm really bad with names. Very similar army to Tim's from game 1, but no Nagash. Instead, he has Manfred and then a lot more bodies. So Vampire Lord, Manfred, 2 blocks of 20 zombies, 30 skeletons, 2 units of 3 Fellbats, 20 Graveguard, Maelstrom. The battle plan is Geomantic Pulse. So there's 4 objectives centraled in, I guess, each lane of the board. The way that you score, you hold 1 for at least 1 objective, you hold 2 for controlling the pulse, and then you score an extra point for each objective adjacent to the pulse that you control, 2 for your tactic, and then 3 for the grand strat. So the special thing for this one is it's the pulse. So at the start of the second round, the player going second picks either side, A or B, that becomes the pulse. And then every turn afterwards, it shifts over by 1. So turn 1, you score 1 point. Turns 2 through 4, you score 3 points, or potentially 3 points. 1 for an objective. No, potentially 4 points. 1 for the objective, 2 for the pulse, 1 for the one adjacent, and then 3 and 4. I think there's a potential 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points. 2 for the pulse, plus 1 for each one adjacent, plus 1 for holding objective, and then so on and so forth. This was going to be a tricky game, I think. It's a lot of bodies. He's got the teleporting lord that does the 12-inch blizzard every turn and then teleports away in the hero phase. With no Nagash, there's no threat of a Hand of Dust, but Manfred is no slouch. He's fairly durable with a new upgrade to his save as well as his War Scroll adjustments, and he's got a lot of bodies. That in combination with his ability to counterstrike and countercharge something to lock it down, as well as summoning to null deploy on objectives, it was a balancing act of not killing stuff while also trying to take objectives. I think his entire plan will be to castle. He's fewer drops than me, so he'd have control of priority. He'd likely play for the double, and not even. I think if it were me, I would actually take first turn, play to win priority on the second turn, because you want to go second. Going second on the second turn allows you to dictate where the pulse goes, and from there, with the amount of bodies, he can just roll his entire army and walk through the objective, deploying me outside of range, pushing me out so I can never contest it, and forcing me to actually have to engage his army. I think my plan or my approach to this was to try and score some early points, nuke the characters. The threat of Blizzard as well as Spirit Gale, just doing more wounds across the army is too great. If he would let me. If he doesn't, depending on if he makes a mistake or not, try and block out some objectives and prevent him from getting on. And just trade. I don't think I can kill his army fast enough, especially with the summoning and the durability, to remove units wholesale. So I think the goal is to just prevent him from scoring enough points early on to basically win the game. I think I'm expecting to lose quite a number of units because I'll have to get out of the boats and block out his avenues of movement onto objectives and go from there. I think it'll all come down to the way that which flank he chooses, which side the pulse is on, and the way the dice play out. Which, spoiler alert, they didn't. So for deployment, he deployed in the center as a castle. He's got his big block of 30 skeletons with heroes behind them. Everything else in the grave sites, and then I've got my ironclad in the center with the frigate and the gun hauler on opposite ends. So, as expected, he takes first turn, and my expectation is he's going to play for the double and give away the priority. With the way that he advanced up, he does expose his vampire lords in the back. His Spirit Gale was actually very, very effective. He rolled a 10 to cast, and so he did 2 wounds to all my heroes, 2 wounds to all my units, and 2 wounds to all the boats. That, in combination with knowing that he's going to play for the double to get control of the pulse and position, not pictured, but he did end up teleporting a couple of units here. So I think it was 20 zombies here, 20 zombies here. He put bats here and bats here, and he held his Graveguard in reserve. I knew that no matter which side he chose to be the pulse, assuming he did win priority, or even if I won priority, he would be able to just deep strike his Graveguard around the grave sites. So my hope was to basically try and nuke the vampires as early as possible, remove a lot of his spell casting. I positioned for this flank. He only had a couple zombies and fellbats here, so I moved the ironclad over here. I used the frigate to fly over and then flew high over here to position for a 3-6 charge on the vampires, and my gun hauler no deployed on I believe it was this gravesite to try and push him back. And my plan was simple: try and nuke the heroes. I mean, with the amount of shooting and the combat power I have, it shouldn't be difficult in theory. And then with the shooting, my battle tactic was to basically have no enemy units within 12 inches of this table edge, which if you throw in Brock, Ironclad, all that shooting to kill 10 zombies or whatever 20 zombies it was, and the 3 fellbats shouldn't be too difficult, right? And then depending on who wins the priority. So if he wins the priority and gives me the turn, he'll likely choose the pulse here, but it gives me the chance for the double. And with the double, I can try and nuke Manfred with my flyover, my shooting, do as much damage to the skeletons as possible. And from there, I can try and control the board and prevent him from landing his Graveguard in a very good position. If he chose to take the turn and give me the pulse, I would choose this side as the pulse. I'd be able to score those points earlier on. It would be a bit more of an uphill battle because he could still control the board with his bodies. Manfred would still be alive, but from there, I think it'd be an easier time. The way the game played out didn't work that way. My shooting, I killed the zombies, but I couldn't kill the 3 fellbats. So I failed my tactic. My combat didn't kill the vampire lords. I dropped one, but the one with Blizzard was still alive. I only did a wound to him with all of my combat. I had Brock as well as 6 riggers fight him in combat and did a single wound. He managed to kill the riggers, healed back up. He did take the priority. He went second. He gave me the double, but because I was still locked in combat with so much stuff, I really couldn't disengage. His skeletons did counterattack, and they basically surrounded and swarmed the frigate. And from there, it was just not good. He was already up in points, and I did manage to extract my army, but you can see that the Vampire Lord with Blizzard was still alive. Manfred, still alive, ended up countercharging. I didn't get a photo, but he ended up teleporting or summoning both blocks of Graveguard and making both 9-inch charges to lift the frigate and everything inside, and he managed to block with the objective and toe tag the Ironclad. So honestly, from there was nothing really I could do. Failing the alpha, him taking the priority and going second to control the pulse, in combination with just my poor dice rolls. I think every other dice I rolled was a 1. I literally just couldn't do any damage. The game was always going to be his. I think if I were to play this game again and play it a little bit more conservatively, I would not have gone for the alpha. I would have gone right here. Guaranteed with my shooting and combat, I would take the objective and play it out. Assuming the dice rolled out exactly as it would, he would put the pulse here. Everything would be positioned over here. I was using the navigator to slow down Manfred as well as the vampires, or maybe the skeleton blocks. It wouldn't have as big of a threat towards me. If he put his Graveguard or any other unit here to try and block me out, I could try and lift them. And I would just play it out, see how much Spirit Gale does over time, just let him chip away, save my orb for the Blizzard, and just be more conservative. I think if the alpha would have worked, lifting both the vampires would have put me in a better position, because he would have had a harder choice in terms of giving me the double versus controlling the pulse. Because where it was positioned, while the skeletons were engaged, they weren't doing much damage. If the vampires are dead, there's no combat threat here. I would be able to disengage and then threaten everything onto Manfred. If he chooses to control the pulse, yes, it's there. But with the double, nothing's on the board yet. I could then try and control the pulse with the Ironclad flying over here and blocking out getting bodies on the objective and try and just roll slowly through his army. If he chose to take the turn to try and kill my units and let me control the pulse, I would have put the pulse here and just with the gun hauler here. He wouldn't have had many good opportunities to summon his units, maybe over here in the corner. And again, I would have been able to just hopefully pick out his units and shoot through them. But nothing I could do when the dice were just not working for me. He made a lot of saves, a lot of ward saves. I just did no damage to him. His Graveguard, when they summoned, made both 9-inch charges. I just kept rolling ones, so that was the game. So game 6, my final game of the day and the event, was against Matthias, running Beastman. Another Toronto local. He actually goes to my hobby store, and I've seen him at local events a lot, but we've never actually played against each other. So I think even though he is from Toronto and part of our broader hobby circle, this was a great opportunity to actually go up against his army, see what he does, and just have a great final game of the day. So his army, Beast of Chaos, Great British Shaman, Doom Bull, another Shaman, 2 units of 10 Ungors, 6 Bulgors, 3 Bulgors, 2 units of 10 Raiders, a Cygor, a Chimera, a Doomblast Dirge Horn. That's an endless spell. I'm trying to figure out what that was. And the Cockatrice. He had it in a Line Breaker, Wizard Finders, and Vanguard. Basically, everything of his army starts off the board, Alpha Strikes, and then if you can, control the board, win the game. If you can't, that's the game. We were walking through, and basically it came down to how much damage his unit of 6 Bulgors and the Doom Bull would do. When they ambush in, they start, I think it was 6 inches away or 7 inches away, and they get like a +1 or +2 to the charge. So effectively he has to make a 5-inch charge. They do a lot of damage, and so if you can Alpha Strike something off the board turn 1, it puts them in a really great position to try and control the board and win the game. Everything else deep strikes in from battle edges and basically an ambushing army. The battle plan was Nexus Collapse, 6 objectives in a staggered deployment with a quarter deployment zone. The way you score, you hold 1, hold 2, hold more, 2 for your tactic, 3 for your grand strat. Oh yes, this was the removing objectives. So the player with the fewest victor points can choose 2 objectives or up to 2 to collapse. On a 4+, everything within 6 of the objective suffers D3 mortal wounds. Once the objectives are collapsed, they're removed from the game, and you can no longer score them. This was another fairly fast game. I think we were over in about 45 minutes. It came down to the Alpha Strike. We talked it out beforehand because we had lunch before this, and we were pretty much, we knew going in, if his Doom Bulls could, or his Bulgors, sorry, could Alpha Strike a big ship off the board and engage everything inside, he would basically control the board, and it would be a game that we could play through. If he couldn't, then I would be able to disengage, fly away, and shoot his army off the board because he would never catch me. And I think that was pretty much it. It just came down to a null deployment. And that's how the game played out. So I have all of my ships in the corner here, and I've got the gun hauler off in the corner, 3 riggers, and 10 Arkanauts to screen out. He deployed a couple of raiders here and here with everything off the board in reserve. He didn't actually end up alpha striking me until the start of turn 2. He got everything into the Ironclad, so I did end up having to commit to a bit of the board. He came really close. I think the Ironclad had 2 wounds left, but he was not able to kill it. And from there, I was able to disengage. I flew high the Ironclad here. I repaired most of the damage with the riggers from the frigate because I had moved it up here. And I basically shot the Doom Bull. I shot the Bulgors, and I shot the Cockroach off. I was able to charge these and kill them in combat. And the gun hauler, unfortunately, also didn't die to the Chimera and the Cygor. I was able to disengage, fly away, and from there, it just came down to controlling the board. He didn't have much in terms of the flanks here, and from turn 3 onwards, all he had left was a couple of Ungor units here and the 2 monsters, with my entire army still alive and able to control the board and shoot. Pretty much it. I think the battle plan went as expected. He attempted the alpha, bounced off, and then I was able to disengage and shoot his army off. I think if his alpha strike had succeeded, it would have been a very different game. Without the Ironclad, I would have lost a lot of firepower. The guys inside would have died. With that being said, there was still a lot in the frigate, and I still think I would have kept the game fairly close. I would have been able to move around the board, play keep away, and still hold objectives. It would come down to how effective my shooting and combat would be. I still think I would have won the game, but it would have been a much closer affair because I would have had much less of a board presence, much less firepower. But his alpha strike failing just meant that the game was over fairly quickly. I think if I wanted to play it really safe, I would have just kept in the corner for the full 2 turns. Kept the screen there simply because he would have had to have everything on the board by turn 2. So his alpha would have gone into some screening units as opposed to the ships. I could have done that to guarantee the win. But honestly, I just wanted to see what it did. And yeah, we played it out. So after 6 games, the end result, I ended up placing 10th out of a field of 38. So top quarter, not too bad. Again, if I'd gotten that major win as opposed to the minor win against the Stormcast opponent, I might have gone a couple places higher, but probably not by much. I think the strength of schedule, I would have probably edged out Zach and maybe Etienne. I don't know who their opponents were. My 2 losses were to Yuri, who came first, and Peter, who came third, the Soulblight Gravelords. So with that strength of schedule in mind, I probably might have placed higher, but I don't know. I mean, still not too bad. The overall results were as expected. I was expecting to do middle of the pack. I was expecting like a 3-3 or 4-2. So it played out exactly like I thought. I did end up winning Best Painted. So that was great. I won a couple of the Chimera painting sets. So there was the basic one as well as the non-metal metal one from Pizarski. Looking forward to trying out those. And I think it'll be something I look forward to next year as well. I think the changes to my army, as I mentioned at the start of the video, I would probably drop the Arkanauts for the next little bit just to try out 3 riggers, see if I really do need the screens. I just think that the riggers provide more utility and better value to my army. Their longer range shooting means that when I fly high with the Ironclad, I can actually get them in range, whereas the Arkanauts being at 9 inches, they're usually not in range when I fly high. They fight better in combat, they can repair the ship, and they're a lot more mobile. So when I disembark them, I can move them around, I can get my screens out further without having to have the Ironclad already in a position to force a disembark, either at the end of the movement phase or pre-plan ahead for the next turn. I think KO are in a very good place in this season. The primal dice, I think, don't really make a huge impact against armies that are already going to dominate the magic phase. Just in terms of volume, they're going to continue dominating whether they have primal dice or not. So armies like Tzeentch or Seraphon are still going to get their spells off. I think where KO are going to shine are against armies that only have 1 or 2 spells to cast. And in that sense, your primal dice actually work in your favor because you don't suffer miscast when dispelling. Unless your opponent irresistibles, I think the odds are stacked for you to unbind that key 1 or 2 spells. And then even against armies that throw a lot of spells at you, the primal dice give you a chance to unbind those 1 or 2 key spells per turn. The Nullstone or Dormants, whether it's the Orb or the Pocket Sand in particular, give you an added boost to try and shut down magic for a turn. And then I think the battle plans, with the way the core tactics work out, along with your battle tome tactics, reward a lot of mobility and an ability to redeploy and reposition. So I think KO, more than other armies, have an easier time scoring those, especially for ones that require you to be on different parts of the board, holding different table edges. Other armies have to pre-plan and commit to them earlier on, whereas KO, with the fly high, the movement, can take those on at later turns. So you can be a little bit more conservative with your deployment. You can null deploy. You have a lot more options, and your mobility works in your favor for scoring those points. Where I think KO do struggle, there are certain battle plans and certain matchups that do make it a lot harder. I think Bone Reapers and potentially Seraphon in the right battle plan are a very tough army for KO to beat, just because they're so durable. They have a lot of bodies, a lot of wounds. They can just stat check you. And I don't think KO can do enough damage over a 5-turn game to make up that points differential before they end up taking you out. But ultimately, I think that's just the nature of Age of Sigmar. You just end up having some matchups, some armies where you go up against, or some missions where you play, where it just is a harder matchup and you're more reliant on either your opponent making a mistake, scoring a double, or just the dice working out in your favor to win the game. So if you made it to the end, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you were able to glean some insights into the way that I built my list and the way I approached each of these games at the event. Whether you play KO or not, I think there's some value in understanding how armies want to play the game and understanding how they want to approach the game. So I hope it helps you in playing Age of Sigmar with whatever army you're playing to be able to think through each of these battle plans in turn, learn a little bit more about each of these armies, and in particular with KO, whether you play with or against them. Make sure you like and subscribe for more weekly content. If you want to check out my other social media platforms, I'll have links in the description below. And if you want to have or check out a deeper dive into my army and my display board, I'll also have a link in the description below. As always, until next time, happy hobbying.